Good morning, afternoon for those who are joining us from different areas, and welcome to this webinar from the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub. We will be discussing vulnerability in time of emergency, shedding light on safeguarding in Syria and Türkiye after 6 months of the devastating earthquake. I am Kinan Diab, the Safeguarding National Representative of Syria. In today's webinar, we will be looking to provide a deeper understanding of vulnerability, and this is to, one, improve the quality and impact of programming by responding to specific needs, and to provide the vital information to help build appropriate and robust safeguarding measures, both for prevention of and respond to safeguarding misconduct. So today, with the help of my speakers, we will introduce some key definitions and concepts, look at what causes vulnerability, and touch on the links on safeguarding, and reflect on the current circumstances for some vulnerable groups to promote internal dialogue at our civil society organizations after this webinar. In order to do so, I will be asking for our speakers' contribution throughout this webinar. Our first speaker will be Lulu Shah, the safeguarding technical expert at SDD, Social Development Direct, and the technical advisor to RSH Syria and Turkey. Lulu has over 15 years of experience in both the humanitarian and development fields. She's been working in different contexts, including Iraq, Palestine, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and other countries in the region, working with several UN agencies and NGOs. Lulu has a bachelor degree in politics and international relations, and she holds a master's degree in violence, conflict, and development. In both degrees, she minored in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, and also on gender. Our next speaker is Amani Kanjo. Amani is a humanitarian professional with over 9 years of experience in Syria and the MENA region, who has worked with different UN agencies, national and international organizations, and private companies. She has a bachelor degree in bioengineering from Aleppo University and a master's degree in molecular biology and genetics from Gaziantep University. With that, I move to you, Lulu, if you can give us a definition of what do we mean by vulnerability and what create different vulnerabilities and their intersectionality. Over to you, Lulu.
Thanks, Kinan. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. So I'll go straight in the interest of time. So first of all, defining vulnerability. Excuse me. I'll just read it out to you. So when an individual or group is unable to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from abuse, exploitation, harassment, or any other harm. And when we think about vulnerability in a humanitarian context, it's really important to understand that actually everyone is inherently vulnerable in humanitarian contexts, and that's largely because there's a huge power imbalance between those who are delivering humanitarian aid and those who are receiving it. And when we think about vulnerability also, it's important to understand that it exists outside in the community generally. When we think about vulnerability in the community at large, we're talking really about protection. But when we're thinking about harm that's caused by our staff or by our organizations or our programs, in that case, we're talking about safeguarding and safeguarding misconduct and who is vulnerable to safeguarding misconduct. A question before we move on that you might want to ask yourselves when you're thinking in your organizations about your assessment of vulnerability is, who's deciding who's vulnerable? What narrative are we using? And we need to be really mindful of using, as it says there, colonial or patriarchal ableist narratives, or others, in fact. So that would be things like saying all disabled people are vulnerable, which of course they're not, and they're differently disabled and they have different types of vulnerabilities. Similarly, patriarchal ideas of all women are vulnerable when we know that they're not, they're differently vulnerable. In colonial, all people in the developing world or in the South, global South, are vulnerable. So we must be really careful when we're thinking about vulnerability and framing it, that we don't homogenize people and put them all into one group. And the best way really of avoiding that is understanding that all communities in their own locations around the world are experts of themselves. They know how they're vulnerable and they know in which ways they're vulnerable. So it's really important that you take the time to sensitively consult them. And that might mean that, when I say sensitive, I'm meaning that you might want to possibly, segregate male and female focus group discussions to understand their vulnerabilities, or you might want to separate people with disabilities and talk to them so that they have a safe space. Consider the physical space that you're consulting them in. Are you putting them at greater risk of harm by having that consultation? Because then it would be counterintuitive. But it's a really vital part of the process of understanding vulnerability to consult communities themselves and consult your staff about the risks that are around. Moving on. So to understand who has power and privilege, who is excluded from a society, who's included, who's on the margins, who's at risk, we really need to understand what is underneath power and privilege, what determines who has power and privilege. And that's really determined by three things here that you can see in this diagram. Their gender and social norms, the social hierarchies that exist in any context, and the beliefs that people have, for example, around class or race or ethnicity and so on. You just want to move forward. And one important thing to think about in the time of emergencies is that the groups that were previously marginalized tend to become much more so during a crisis. So it's important to understand that shift. And that's because those groups who previously had very fragile protective or support mechanisms will have become even more so as those support mechanisms have eroded during crisis. It also means that perpetrators can continue with impunity because police systems, various other things, judicial systems won't be there to hold them to account. So moving on now to think about intersectionality. This is the RSH definition of intersectionality, but I'll just explain it to you, I think, in a bit more of a layperson's way, which is a bit easier to understand. So essentially, intersectionality is probably a word that you've come across quite a lot, but it gets used quite a lot. But essentially, what it is a theory and a tool that helps us to understand vulnerability better, and it does that by asking us to break down what are the different identity markers or characteristics that people have in any given context. It might be gender, it might be age related, they may be female-headed households. What are the different identities? And some are listed on the screen there. And how do those different identities intersect to create either increasing or decreasing levels of vulnerability? And that can change over time. Could just thanks. And so why is it really important that we use an intersectional lens? Well, when we use an intersectional lens, just as I said just then, it reminds us the vulnerability is not static. Where you were in the Türkiye, Syria response 6-7 months ago will look very different to now. Vulnerability is very dynamic. It changes over time. It changes as responses evolve. So that's really what we're trying to get to with this conversation today, is have a reflection on where you are with understanding vulnerability, what's changed, what hasn't changed. And oh, okay. Yeah, the other thing that is important about using an intersectional lens is it helps us as organizations also understand how we're thinking now back to safeguarding, how we can either increase or decrease people's vulnerability. So we're not passive participants in any emergency response. We are active participants. We're part of a wider structure, and we need to understand how we could affect people's vulnerability. Go ahead, thanks. And this is really demonstrated by this diagram here. So, lots of organizations would say, because we're very principled and we start with really good goals and ambitions, that would never happen in our organization. Safeguarding misconduct would never happen. We're good people. We don't, that's not our goal. But actually, as you see from this organization, you can still have the best intentions, but vulnerabilities still exist for a number of intersecting reasons. So here, if you look at the identity markers we've got listed there, so gender, sexual identity, age, migrant status, so forth, they are those identity markers we were speaking of, and they don't operate in isolation. They're actually connected to all these other spaces. So if you could just move through those, Mariam, thanks. So at the community level, if you take, for example, a woman, so you're thinking about gender now, just one singular identity of hers, if she's existing in a community where there's high levels of sexual violence, or where women are not, able to be equally employed or have access to equal pay, for example, that they have less mobility in physical space. If you move through now that woman perhaps works for an organization, but the leadership is all male, and there are heavy patriarchal norms in that society, and the legal systems don't protect her. In fact, she's going to be at an increased level of vulnerability than perhaps a male who's operating in the same space. And so when we employ as well from our organization, if you take the organization piece here on the left, we don't just employ anyone who just naturally fits into the values that we've set. We employ them as individuals who are part of a wider community, part of a wider structural system and a culture. So it's important to put in place really strong safeguarding mechanisms, recognizing that there are always loopholes, and that as much as we have high ideals, we actually have to put in place things to reduce vulnerability both in our workplaces and in our programs. Go ahead, please. So why does understanding vulnerability create better responses? Well, the first reason, we'll go over two different things here. The first reason is really around quality programming. All of us want to do good quality programming. We also quite often have very limited resources. And so when you understand vulnerability better, you know who's most in need and whose rights and dignity you need to be protecting and preserving. So once you understand who's most vulnerable, you can then channel those funds much more economically and more efficiently, and with greater impact as well. It also, an understanding of vulnerability also helps us to become more sustainable, and our programs to be sustained and retain sustained mobilization after we close out. So we do that because when we're addressing the most vulnerable, we provide an opportunity to equalize and to build back better. And linked into that, it also improves resilience because we're preparing the most vulnerable so that should a crisis happen again, they will be ready to bounce back. There's also a second reason here. Thank you. Go ahead. And the second is really, this underpins a lot of our work, and there are ethical and moral reasons why it's important to understand vulnerability. The four protection principles that you see here, the first one is one that probably most of you are familiar with, because it says avoid exposing people to further harm as a result of your actions. And essentially that is do no harm. Probably all of you have heard that before, do no harm. But the protection principles, do no harm is just simply one of those. And in fact, those principles and the humanitarian principles underpin everything that we do. They underpin the humanitarian charter, they underpin the sphere guidance. So they are critical to understand and to know beyond do no harm. And when we understand vulnerability, we can make sure that we are upholding those protection principles. So apart from doing no harm, which we've talked about already, they also ask us to ensure that people's access is impartial. How do we know it's impartial if we don't know who the various groups are that are vulnerable and that we're reaching them? The protection principle 3 asks us to protect people from physical and psychological harm arising from violence and coercion. Again, how are our staff engaging at distributions and so forth? Are they understanding people's trauma? Is the approach trauma informed? When we're dealing with cases around safeguarding, do we really feel confident that we're engaging with people well? And the fourth one, around assisting people to claim their rights, access available remedies, and recover from the effects of abuse. Again, we need to know who is likely to not be able to claim their rights and access remedies, so in order to be able to make sure that we're responding. And final note on here, which is really important, is to remember that staff can be vulnerable too. Quite often, I know I've seen it certainly in my career, that we think so much outwards. We even on our data, we think about collecting data around female-headed households, but we don't often think about, the female-headed households that are in our own staff, and whether we're responding as we understood from that diagram there. Our staff are part of a wider system, and they are equally vulnerable at times, and so it's really important to make sure that our safeguarding measures address them as well. This was, I understand, really critically important also, given that the aid workers that were existing in Gaziantep when the earthquake happened were already overwhelmed when this happened and had an extra burden. So it's really critically important to think about your staff's vulnerability as well. So has the context changed 7 months on? This will be something that all of you in your own locations will have to sit and, I'm sure that you're doing it already, but this is a little tool that can help you. I use it for risk registers, building risk registers, but it's also a good way to sort of do a situational analysis. So if you're not familiar with this word in English, it's pestle and a mortar is a tool to crush up spices. So use the pestle acronym there to think about political, environmental, social, technological, legal, and economic aspects of the context. And so you might want to ask yourselves when you're reflecting, has anything changed in the last 7 months in the political environment that we're working that may increase or decrease vulnerabilities? Has anything changed environmentally? I understand that when the earthquakes happened, the temperature was around -2 to -6 or something like that. Obviously, now we've been having heat waves in Europe. Are the provisions appropriate? Has anything changed environmentally? Are there new camps that have been set up or not? How serviced are they? Socially, are different groups being worked with differently? Are organizations interacting with different groups differently 7 months on? Are there new vulnerabilities that are emerging? Technologically, has technology been used in some way? Is that putting people at increased risk if there are, digital Facebook groups or things like that where you've used that might put people at increased harm if not safeguarded properly? Legally, have there been any new provisions? Is anyone left out of those provisions and therefore at increased risk? And then economically, obviously, there's a global economic decline. Has that changed people's purchasing power? Are the jobs that were still available for everyone? Is there a gender bias in who's now able to get work again, or with what level of pay? So this is just a little tool. Pestle's a really useful way to just have a situational analysis and see what's changed and how that would affect vulnerabilities. Go ahead, please. And you can also think about what's changed in the current context in relation to those intersecting identities that we were talking about previously. So thinking through, I'll just go through a couple and think through some examples that might be relevant to you. Amani's going to go on to talk about actual case studies in a minute, but this is just to plant some seeds for you. So with gender, for example, we know that in Turkey that there is perhaps an issue around single mothers who are being put into accommodation now who may be separated from their wider networks, and that might put them at increased risk of harm. We know that with age, for example, this happens a lot in emergencies, that children will marry early and then be classified as a new household in order to bring more provisions, more aid into a household. It's increased risk of dropout from school, increased risk of child labour and so forth. Equally, older people, there's a strong link between disability and age. Are people that are in temporary accommodation receiving the same level of care? Are they able to maintain their dignity? Ethnic and sexual minorities, this is something that's come up certainly around, the Roma population. Are they being denied access to services and aid? And legal status, very important one here around the classification as refugee and the vulnerability of Syrian males being deported, and of course with that, family separation. Moving on, please. So I think we're going to hand over now to Amani to go through some case studies with you. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Lulu. It was very great Now we have identified what vulnerability is, what groups are at higher risk of being vulnerable, what are the factors that plays into that. Manu, we need that translated into practicality. I know that you were based in Turkey when the earthquake occurred. So from your professional and personal experience, if you can translate those concepts into something practical for CSOs to work on, please, the mic is yours.
Yes, thank you, Kenan, for asking, and thanks, Lulu, for the thorough explanation on vulnerability and its complexity. So for now, I would like to take the time to give you two examples on the vulnerabilities in the aftermath of southern Turkey earthquake. Let me tell you the story of Ebru in the wake of that devastating earthquake that shook southern Turkey and Syria. Ebru is a Turkish resilient woman in her 80s. Her story underscores the ongoing vulnerabilities she faced and the specific challenges that came with her age. So Ebru, who is a resident of a Turkish peaceful town, lived in a cozy home with her family when the earthquake struck. The powerful tremors shattered their residence, leaving her and her family without shelter. Initially, they thought or sought refuge in makeshift tents alongside fellow survivors. However, as time passed, these crowded tents became or increasingly uncomfortable for them to live. One of the pressing challenges she encountered was the sanitation facilities. Ebru, like other elderly women in her age, found it impossible to use squat toilets, for example. They were in desperate need of shared toilets to ensure their comfort and dignity. The lack of such facilities made them more vulnerable. As the temperature actually, Ebru's various vulnerabilities, as she's in her 80s, was further compounded by her chronic illnesses, such as hypertension, diabetes, heart diseases. She required regular checkups. However, the earthquake disrupted healthcare system, making it increasingly difficult for Ebru and women in her age to manage their conditions. As the temperature dropped down at that time, Ebru and others struggled to stay warm. Some elderly women suffered from urinary incontinence, which required larger pads and warmer clothing. Privacy remained a persistent issue for them. Maintaining their dignity, especially when it came to a personal hygiene, was increasingly difficult for them. Using public showers outside exposed them to imminent risks of sexual exploitation and abuse, and a constant source of fear for them. 6 months later, Ebru moved into a temporary shelter, a container with 4 plain walls that hardly felt like home. The psychological scars from the earthquake ran deep, and the fear of violence and abuse continued to haunt Ebru and other women with her community. In this challenging environment, organizations played a vital role by distributing essentials like tents, water bottles, ready-to-eat kits. However, much more was needed to address a deep-rooted vulnerability that elderly women like Ebru face on a daily basis. And also for the next case study, I can tell you as well Sarah's struggle as a Syrian adolescent girl in northwest Syria in the wake of an earthquake. 7 months have passed since the devastating Turkey-Syria earthquake, and the situation in exhausted northern Syria remains dire, especially for millions of women and children who face a humanitarian crisis for more than 12 years so far. Many of them have experienced displacement up to 20 times. Before the earthquake, the displacement crisis forced 7 to 8 individuals to share tents together. Now, in the aftermath of the earthquake, the overcrowding has intensified with 16 to 17 people packed in each tent. Imagine that. These living conditions leave women and girls, and in particular adolescents, exposed to harsh realities, devoid of privacy, susceptible to sexual exploitation, assault, and abuse. The catastrophic earthquake that rocked Turkey and Syria in February 2023 shattered the world of its internally displaced 17-year-old Sarah. Sarah, along with her parents and 3 siblings, living in a modest house in Syria, a region already affected by conflict. When the earthquake struck, their home crumbled, and amidst the chaos, Sarah found herself in a shelter, away and separated from her parents. She's now like an accompanied minor until she reunified with her family later. So Sarah's story exemplifies the pre-existing vulnerabilities that had long haunted adolescent girls like her in Syria. The conflict has disrupted her education, her dreams. Many of adolescent girls in her community faced similar risks, such as early forced marriage, child labor, various forms of sexual assault, exploitation, and abuse at any time. However, challenges persisted, because and due to damaged healthcare facilities that made it challenging for Sarah and her peers to access essential health care and protection care, such as sexual reproductive health or GBV services. In that way, the contextual risk factors intensify the pre-existing vulnerabilities, like exactly what Lulu has mentioned in her slides. We need now to implore the international community to prioritize the needs of those vulnerable groups, such as adolescent girls. Sarah's story serves as a poignant reminder of the resilience of children facing war in Syria and everywhere. Sarah's narrative emphasizes the vital role of humanitarian community in delivering immediate relief, protection, and support to help those young youth lives to rebuild and secure their future by considering the deep-rooted vulnerabilities. And that's all from my side for the stories.
Thank you very much, Amani. Lulu, would you like to give us a reflection on those cases? I know that, again, there are examples, but most of our attendees can relate to those cases in their private and professional lives.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what strikes me about those 2 case studies there is that, if we were not taking an intersectional lens, we could just look at that and say, there's 2 females and we're thinking about shelter, and we could just homogenize them as, you know, all females are vulnerable. But in fact, when you apply an intersectional lens and you look at the context they're in and their age, and for example, with the first Ebru, I believe her name was, you know, her vulnerability was pre-existing in relation to her age, but it was far more exacerbated afterwards because of her insecurity around shelter, the level of isolation she was going through, how that would affect her mental health and her ability to be independent, which would then feed into sort of, yeah, the disability health kind of compounding deterioration. When you look at the second example, the vulnerabilities are really associated with loss of education and you know, the risk of child marriage and so forth. So I think that they just really perfectly describe how important it is to use an intersectional lens when we're assessing different people's vulnerabilities, and not to just be reductive and to say, you know, there is an issue with females in shelter. Actually, it tells us that it's much more than just about privacy and dignity and, you know, wash provisions. Actually, it's much wider than that. Oh, you're on mute, I think, Kinan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I see we have a lot of questions. Before we do that, maybe again, just a reminder on the next slide on what to keep our eyes on. So next slide, please. Yeah. Here we go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so again, in a nutshell, just to keep in mind in our work, who have and who haven't we consulted or involved in our work. Are we asking the right questions when we're consulting? Who are we consulting? How are we consulting different groups? Again, do we know that you are involving them? What changes can we make with this updated vulnerability knowledge, and how will we communicate these changes to the affected groups? I see one hand raised, so I will be asking all of our participants to type in their questions, and I will move to the Q&As. I'm afraid I'm facing some technical difficulties. Okay, so starting with the first one. What measures can be taken to ensure the safety of vulnerable individuals in their homes or residential care facilities? I think I will ask you, Lulu, to respond to that one, and Amani, if you have any comments afterwards, please go ahead. Lulu, please.
Yeah, thanks, Kinan. I saw this and I saw the one underneath it, and I think I'll take them together. So the follow-on question underneath is, just see, vulnerable. Does it cover targeting beneficiaries only in the humanitarian context, or does it include vulnerable groups who are living within the community? Well, again, this firstly, this comes back to whether we're talking about generalized vulnerabilities or we're talking about specific vulnerabilities in relation to our organizations. But I think the key thing here is, you know, if we bring back that intersectionality piece, it reminds us that in different settings, people will be differently vulnerable. If you take an example of disability, for example, a person who has a physical disability will not be equally vulnerable to a person who has, let's say, an intellectual or cognitive disability. So it's very difficult to just have blanket responses. But if you have, you know, a very acknowledged group vulnerability, you would then want to respond in that way. So, for example, if we understand that, you know, there is an issue with Syrian refugee males being vulnerable to deportation, we might want to do something specific around that. If we want to think about the Roma community being excluded from camps, we might specifically want to do that, something about that. But all of this will come down to appropriate needs assessments and understanding who is vulnerable, And then once you understand who's vulnerable and how, and that's really done by, again, speaking to the experts, the people themselves in the populations you choose to work with. Once you understand what those vulnerabilities are, then you start building your response. And you also get to determine whose duty of care it is, which is really essential in this case, because there may be state provisions. So the top question was around, addressing vulnerability in people's homes and in residential care facilities. Well, if they are private care facilities, there will be a different level of response than there might be outside in people's homes if the state's providing the temporary accommodation or so forth. So, and whether it's an NGO's responsibility, then if there is no one responding, would we fill the gap? So it's really important to understand needs, to understand whose duty of care it is, and then you can plan your response. And I think a really good way to just stay informed and to share the most up-to-date information is really just to attend clusters. And hopefully this conversation helps you to think about, if you're doing an education program or you're doing, I don't know, a health program, not just attending the health cluster or the education cluster, actually intersectionality and this reflection should help you think with those two case studies, how if you're doing something on health with older people, you might also want to attend the protection cluster. And if there's a disability age working group, you want to attend that. And that's to share your experiences, because you are on the ground, you're the ones working and you're interfacing with communities every day. So it's really vital that you feed that information around vulnerability back into the system, and that also you learn what provisions are out there so that you can then take that back. And one of the key things that we find ourselves doing where we're on the front lines is that, because we might be small organizations, we may not have a lot of expertise, a key role for us in reducing vulnerability is around advocacy for those communities and referrals to services. So that might be the sole thing that you do, is understanding what's out there and then being able to refer people and provide that kind of information and that conduit. And that's perfectly acceptable. Thanks, Kinan.
Thank you very much. This one is from Lebanon, coming from safeguarding MPCA specialist. The question is as follows: from your experience, can we list 3 top vulnerabilities among children and women, exposing them to safeguarding and SEH issues? And what are the lessons learned, pretty much, that you would like to share? I think I will ask you, Amani, to take that one and see if Lulu has any points to add.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Kina, for the questions, and Lamia, that is really need to be answered. From the experience from the field, what we see most common or prevalent cases from safeguarding and PSEA survivors, I can say, like, as I mentioned, adolescent girls would be a target, and women and girls with disabilities as well could be exploited badly with their vulnerability. And also the widows, women, could be also a target. So after that, you have mentioned, like, what can be done for them. Actually, as a humanitarian community, as organizations, either national or international, we can do a lot. We can, as Lulu has mentioned, like, coordinate and conduct need assessment and do an appropriate vulnerability analysis for the context, either in Syria or in Turkey after the earthquake. We can coordinate with the national designated authorities that really they are doing a great work. For example, AFAD and government of Turkey Provincial Directorate of Migration Management, they have managed to work with emergency protection cases, including those like issues related to gender or inclusion of marginalized groups. We can let's say, support and strive to increase the representation of these vulnerable groups, and seek and work to meaningful participation and taking the roles in decision making, so they represent their groups, and they can be really in a good position to work for their cases. Of course, like for the long term, let's say, change, we always want to think about gender inequality, and through structured long term transformative action always, so that also include men and boys, of course, and challenge some bad social norms which compound the discrimination, violence against those marginalized, vulnerable groups. That's what I can add here.
Very much. Lulu, I noticed that you're taking notes, so maybe you would like to weigh in.
Yes, I was just scribbling down a few things. I was nodding profusely because I agree with everything that Amani was saying just there. I think from my experience that one of the things that you really want to maintain is a level of visibility of vulnerable groups, and a space that can be safe, that will not only make them visible, but also allow them some information that can help them to retain a sense of power and agency. Because the risk, the risk of gender-based violence, for example, goes up infinitely in times of emergency. And therefore creating spaces that we can share information about referral services and so forth is really, really important. And I think another key thing to remember when we're talking about vulnerable groups and what we can do to support them, but actually we'll bring it back all the time to we should be asking them themselves. And there's this phrase that's used a lot in the disability movement, nothing about us without us. I think it's a really important phrase to just remember generally when we're working with extremely vulnerable groups, is that you can be working with women-led organizations. Seek out those organizations in that location in order to be able to respond appropriately. It might be women-led, it might be refugee-led, it might be IDP-led organizations, Roma-led organizations, but essentially try to get local representation because that would be the best way to protect women and children and understand their specific vulnerabilities with those specific identities. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I have 3 questions. I'll try to go through them one by one. There's one that we didn't go through, which is, as humanitarian organizations, are we responsible for targeting beneficiaries or the community as a whole? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about programming and, again, consulting, even if our direct beneficiaries are are specific criteria of the community, how our project can keep in mind, if that's the correct term, the community as a whole.
Would you like me to take that, or
yes, please?
Okay. Well, I mean, if we're thinking about this particular crisis, we might have one answer. If we think about another crisis, we might have another. So, really thinking about the scale and the level of destruction and the level of needs that in any location is important. So, in some cases, for example, I worked on the Nepal earthquake response several years ago now. In that case, the devastation was so total that it was instructed by the humanitarian coordinator to just do blanket distributions. There was no need to be selective. Just go to every household, do assessments everywhere, and don't go empty-handed. It's that bad. You need to turn up with something. In other cases, you may not have that. In other responses, you may not have that. There may be, if it's in a conflict in particular, there might be particular areas that are affected versus others that are not. And there may be also targeted groups that are affected in a setting, maybe that their ethnicity makes them more at risk, and you might have to do additional programming with them in order to have an equitable response. So even if you're doing blanket programming, you may need to do additional things. Don't know if any of you have seen that diagram of people trying to look over a fence. You've probably seen it in trainings and so forth, but some people need one box to look over the fence and stand on it, and others need two boxes to look over the fence. So it's just important to understand, even if we're working across the whole community, there are still not homogeneous needs. You will still need to give some people two boxes to look over that fence. So it really depends on what your needs assessment tells you, and that will determine who you work with. And it will also be governed by the humanitarian coordinator, who will, issue directives on the way in which you should be working. I hope that helps.
Well, the visualization of equity was definitely interesting. Okay, I again, there's one that I'm keen to ask you actually, but before I move to that, we are asked to provide a practical example of intersectionality that decreases vulnerability in a crisis context. So if you have a particular case in mind that you can respond to. And then we have one that is, if we understand there is an exploitation or weakness of weakness, sorry, how is the evaluation carried out, and how is the intervention carried out despite the sensitivity of the issue, especially in an area of a context. I'm just looking at that to see. So we're talking about weakness that is being exploited, and how can we overcome the sensitivities? So maybe if you can elaborate with a practical example, it might be useful.
Again, myself or Amani?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe Lulu, if you can go first, and Amani, if you have anything to add on.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take the one on intersectionality, and maybe Amani, if you take the practical examples on approaching sensitive, evaluating weaknesses and opportunities for exploitation. So if I take the first one then on intersectionally, how can it decrease vulnerability in a crisis context? Well, again, from personal experience, that's all I can draw on really. I worked for what was called Handicap International. Now it's Humanity and Inclusion. That was 13 years ago in Gaza. And we know that there was a lot of work being done. Actually, I think quite a few agencies were doing work at the time on inclusive education. And there were some, every time there's a siege, then there were sort of facilities, educational facilities that were in place that were accessible for children who were disabled, particularly physically disabled. And every time there was an aerial attack, then those things would be destroyed, whereas other children might be able to access other, buildings that were then opened up for education immediately afterwards. In fact, the options were vastly limited for children who were wheelchair users, for example. And so you would prioritize, your intersectional understanding of access to education would prioritize those children who have very, very limited options for accessing a safe space to be educated in, and also recognizing that their educational needs are particularly different too, and may need to be better resourced up front with things like providing orthotic devices or, mobility aids and so forth. So in order to bring everyone to, a point where they could equitably receive education programming, in fact, you'd have to do a lot of front-end work with children with disabilities to open up those educational spaces. So, understanding there that not all children are the same. And in order to decrease the vulnerability of children with disabilities who are already pre-existingly, vulnerable, it requires an intersectional lens to be able to respond appropriately. I'll hand over to Amani for the next one.
Before we do that, actually, there's just for time limits, maybe we can also shed light on this with that example. I have a question that I have. We can see that with the current climate change. We see the earthquake in Morocco, the floods we see in Libya. With this kind of like emergencies that occur in very again, it's a disaster. What vulnerability changes could we see? I'm also directing that to you, if you don't mind. So pretty much what to keep an eye for in such, again, for Syria, we know that the conflict was somehow chronic and then we had emergency, but in such natural disasters, what to keep an eye for, in a sense?
You mean in what can NGOs do more broadly to reduce vulnerability in those sorts of contexts?
Pretty much, yes, but before that, maybe what are the changes in vulnerability that we should keep an eye for? Is there any particular pattern that we should keep in mind, or is it context-based in a sense? So it is not predictable, the changes in vulnerability during disasters.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the cluster system is framed around those key areas of vulnerability that might look different in different contexts. For example, food security may not be an issue in all contexts, but there is a cluster around that, water and sanitation may not be necessarily an issue. If you're in Iraq during the conflict, then and those places were being attacked, water sewage plants and so forth were being attacked, that would then make that a much more critical area to look at. If you're operating in an area where there's famine, obviously your food security cluster is going to be, pretty important. So I think the cluster system identifies those areas, but what we can be doing to move on to the other phase is to really just make sure that we as a community get data and that we really try to document our learning and that we use that and promote it and share it, and that the work that we do tries to not just think about the immediate emergency response, but we link it very clearly into the early recovery phase. When we're thinking through how we design our programs, think what next. Don't just limit it. Think about what could possibly happen next. And in some contexts, we constantly operate between this. It may be the same in Syria, but certainly in Palestine, you move between emergency 1 minute and then you're back to development programming, and then you're back into emergency, and then you're back into development programming. You never really fully shift out of one or the other. So just having that kind of dynamic thinking helps us to be able to be kind of responsive in the moment, but also that learning and the advocacy we do can shape better programs. And certainly in disaster response, one of the big things about prevention is informing communities. So all of that learning and being proactive about prevention is helpful.
Thank you very much. I know we have 2 more questions in the chat, but unfortunately we don't have enough time to go through those. I will make sure that when we are sharing the recording and the slides of this session to respond to any points that are not already covered. Before we leave, I would like to thank both of our speakers, Lulu and Amani, for your inputs and informative presentations. I would like to thank our participants for their engagement. Feel free to communicate with me directly. You will have my email in the chat. That's pretty much for any organizations operating in Syria. My colleagues Heather and Gamze will be able to respond to any inquiries that come from CSOs based in Turkey. And I wish you a great day.